The message from my son-in-law arrived at 9:14 p.m. 3 short sentences. Cold. Final. Stay out of our business. We don't need your money anymore. And stop coming to the bakery. For a moment I simply stared at the screen. 6 years. 6 years of paying their rent. 6 years of covering equipment loans. 6 years of keeping that little bakery alive. And now I was being told to stay away. I typed only 2 words. No problem. Then I opened my banking app. The first payment was the building lease. $3,200 a month. Automatic transfer. I pressed cancel. The second payment was the equipment loan. $1,150 a month. Industrial ovens. Mixers. Display refrigerators. I pressed cancel. The third payment was the supplier credit line. Flour. Sugar. Butter. Coffee beans. Another $980 every month. I pressed cancel. In less than 60 seconds. Their bakery lost every dollar that was keeping it open. The screen asked one last question. Are you sure you want to cancel all scheduled payments? I smiled. Yes. Because if they wanted me to stay out of their business. That was exactly what I was going to do. But before I continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support really helps this channel grow. That was the moment everything began to fall apart. My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 64 years old. And until that night, I was the silent partner behind the most popular little bakery in our neighborhood. Most people believed the bakery belonged entirely to my daughter Emily and her husband Kyle. Their photos were on the website. Their smiles greeted customers every morning behind the counter. The shop was called Morning Crust. Small. Warm. Always smelling like fresh bread and cinnamon. Every morning people lined up outside the door before sunrise. Croissants. Sourdough. Cinnamon rolls. The place sold out almost every day. Customers thought it was a young couple chasing their dream. What they didn't know was that the dream had been built almost entirely with my money. 6 years earlier Emily had walked into my house holding a thick stack of papers. A business plan. Her hands were shaking slightly. But her eyes were bright. Dad, she said, I think we found the perfect place for a bakery. Kyle stood beside her, smiling confidently. Back then I liked him. He was polite. Hardworking. Ambitious. The kind of man who shook your hand firmly and looked you straight in the eye. He even called me sir in those days. The startup costs were bigger than they expected. Much bigger. The building lease alone was $3,200 a month. Commercial baking equipment cost almost $80,000. Then came renovations, licenses, insurance, and permits. By the time everything was calculated, the total investment reached nearly $200,000. Emily and Kyle managed to secure a small bank loan. But it covered barely half. The rest came from me. At the time I told myself it was just an investment. But the truth was simpler. I was a father helping his daughter chase a dream. The bakery opened on a rainy Tuesday morning. And almost immediately, it became a success. Lines out the door. Shelves empty before noon. People posting photos of pastries online. Every evening Emily would call me. Dad, we sold out again today. Her voice always sounded excited. Proud. And every time I heard it, I felt proud too. Proud that I had helped make it happen. But success changes people. Slowly. Quietly. At first Kyle stopped calling me sir. Then he stopped thanking me for the payments. Then the joke started. Little comments about how I worried too much about money. About how younger people understood business better. At the time I ignored it. I told myself it was nothing. Just a young man trying to prove himself. But looking back now, that was the beginning of the problem. Because somewhere along the way, my son-in-law stopped seeing me as the man who helped build their bakery. And started seeing me as the man who needed to stay out of it. The first year after the bakery opened was the happiest Emily had sounded in a long time. She called me almost every evening. Sometimes just to talk. Sometimes to tell me how many croissants they sold that morning. Sometimes to ask small questions about expenses. Dad, is it normal for the electricity bill to be this high? Dad, should we refinance the equipment loan? I didn't mind. Numbers had been my life for 40 years. Before retirement, I worked as a financial planner. Helping people manage businesses, investments, retirement funds. Money never confused me. People did. Still, I was happy to help. Morning Crust was doing better than anyone expected. Within 6 months the bakery had regular customers. Within a year they had lines out the door every Saturday morning. Emily handled the baking. Kyle handled the front counter and suppliers. At least that was the plan. But slowly something started to change. Kyle began making more decisions without mentioning them to me. At first it was small things. Switching coffee suppliers. Ordering new packaging with the bakery logo. Nothing major. But then the numbers started shifting. One evening Emily called me sounding nervous. Dad. Kyle thinks we should expand the menu. Expand how? I asked. Sandwiches. Soups. Maybe even pizza in the evenings. I frowned. Do the numbers support that? I'm not sure, she admitted. Then you should run the numbers first. She promised they would. But a week later I visited the bakery and saw a brand new sandwich display fridge. Price tag still taped to the side. $4,800. I found Kyle near the espresso machine. You bought new equipment? I asked. He nodded casually. Yeah. Good investment. Did you calculate the return? He shrugged. We'll figure it out. That was the first time I felt a small warning in my gut. Not anger. Just concern. Kyle was confident. Maybe too confident. Still, the bakery kept making money. Customers loved the place. So I told myself not to interfere. But the second warning came a few months later. It happened during a supplier meeting. I had stopped by early one morning with fresh strawberries from a local farm. Kyle was talking to a flour distributor near the counter. I stood nearby quietly while they finished their conversation. When the supplier left, Kyle turned to me. Oh, hey Daniel. Daniel. Not sir. Not Mr. Hayes. Just Daniel. The change was small. But I noticed. I heard part of that conversation, I said. You're switching flour suppliers? Yeah, he replied. Cheaper. How much cheaper? About 8%. I nodded slowly. And the quality? Kyle shrugged. Flour is flour. That answer bothered me. Bakeries live and die by ingredients. But I didn't push the conversation further. Instead I asked something else. Did you compare the long-term costs? Kyle leaned back against the counter. And smiled. But the smile wasn't friendly. Daniel, we've got this. For a moment the bakery felt very quiet. The ovens hummed softly in the kitchen. Customers chatted near the window tables. But between Kyle and me, something had shifted. It was the first time he spoke to me like that. Not angry. Not openly rude. Just dismissive. Like I was an old man who didn't understand modern business. I nodded. All right. Then I left. Emily called me later that night. Her voice sounded tired. Dad. Kyle said you were upset today. I wasn't upset. He thinks you don't trust him. That made me pause. Emily, I said gently, this bakery exists because I trusted both of you. She didn't answer for a few seconds. Then she said quietly. I know. But the way she said it made me realize something uncomfortable. Kyle had already started talking to her about me. And not in a good way. At the time I still believed it was just stress. Running a business is hard. People argue. People get defensive. But looking back now, that was the moment the real problem began. Because Kyle had started seeing my help as interference. And once that idea took root in his mind, it began growing like a weed. Slow. Quiet. But impossible to ignore. The second year of the bakery was even more successful than the first. Morning crust had become a neighborhood habit. People stopped by before work. Parents brought their kids on Saturday mornings. Local offices ordered trays of pastries for meetings. By spring, Emily and Kyle had hired 3 employees. A cashier. A baker's assistant. And a college student who helped with deliveries. On paper, everything looked good. Revenue was steady. Customer traffic was growing. But the expenses were growing faster. I noticed it one afternoon while reviewing the monthly numbers. Emily still emailed me their financial summaries every few weeks. At least she used to. But lately the reports had become shorter. Less detailed. That day I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop. The spreadsheet on the screen showed something strange. Their ingredient costs had jumped nearly 30%. I stared at the numbers. That didn't make sense. Flour prices had barely moved. Sugar had gone up slightly, but not enough to explain the difference. I picked up the phone and called Emily. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hi Dad. Her voice sounded distracted. Quick question, I said. Did something change with your ingredient suppliers? A short pause. Kyle switched a few things. What things? Different coffee brand. Different chocolate supplier. I leaned back in my chair. Why? He said the previous suppliers were too expensive. I opened another tab on my laptop. Pulled up last year's numbers. Compared them. The math still didn't make sense. If he switched to cheaper suppliers, I said slowly, the costs should have gone down. Another pause. Longer this time. I don't really handle that part anymore, Emily admitted. My stomach tightened slightly. What do you mean you don't handle it? Kyle's been managing most of the finances lately. That was new. When the bakery opened, Emily handled the baking and the books. Kyle managed the counter and suppliers. It had worked well. Balanced. But now something had shifted. Emily, I said carefully, have you looked at the numbers recently? Not closely. Maybe you should. She sighed softly. Dad, everything's fine. That sentence always worries me. Because in business, people only say everything's fine when they don't actually know. Still, I didn't push further. I closed the spreadsheet and finished my coffee. But the numbers stayed in the back of my mind. 2 weeks later I stopped by the bakery early one morning. It was just after 6. The sun was barely up. Emily was in the kitchen rolling dough. Kyle stood near the counter scrolling through his phone. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Customers would arrive soon. Morning, I said. Emily smiled. Kyle barely looked up. Hey. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat at one of the small tables near the window. After a few minutes I noticed something else. A new espresso machine. Big. Shiny. Professional grade. Definitely expensive. I walked over and read the brand name on the side. Then I checked the model number on my phone. $11,400. I turned toward Kyle. When did you buy this? He glanced at the machine. Oh. Last week. Did you pay cash? He shook his head. Financing. For how much? He shrugged. About $200 a month. That answer was wrong. Even without checking the exact loan terms, I knew the numbers didn't work. A machine that expensive would cost at least $400 a month. Probably more. 200. I repeated. Yeah. He said it quickly. Too quickly. Something about the conversation made my instincts wake up. After 40 years working with finances, I had learned to recognize certain signals. Deflection. Vague answers. Numbers that didn't add up. I nodded slowly. All right. Kyle leaned against the counter. Then he said something that caught me off guard. You know, Daniel. He used my name again. Not Dad. Not Mr. Hayes. Just Daniel. You don't need to worry about every little detail here. I'm not worrying, I said calmly. I'm just asking. He smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. We're running the business now. The words hung in the air. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Emily called from the kitchen. Kyle, the oven's ready. He turned and walked away without another word. I finished my coffee and left the bakery. The sky outside had turned bright orange with the sunrise. Cars were already filling the street. Customers were starting to arrive. Everything looked normal. But something inside me felt uneasy. Because after that conversation, I started wondering a very uncomfortable question. What exactly was Kyle doing with the bakery's money? For the next few weeks, I tried to ignore the feeling. After all, the bakery still looked successful from the outside. Customers were coming in. The shelves were empty by noon. Emily still sounded excited when she talked about new recipes. But the numbers. The numbers kept whispering that something wasn't right. I stopped asking direct questions. Instead, I started watching. Quietly. One Tuesday morning I arrived earlier than usual. Just after 5. The lights were already on inside the bakery. Emily's car was parked behind the building. But Kyle's truck wasn't there. I walked inside through the back entrance. The kitchen smelled like warm butter and cinnamon. Emily stood at the counter shaping dough. She looked up, surprised. Dad? You're here early. Couldn't sleep, I said. Thought I'd bring you breakfast. I handed her a bag with coffee and sandwiches. She smiled gratefully. Kyle walked in about 10 minutes later. He froze for half a second when he saw me. Just a small pause. But I noticed it. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied. He went straight to the office at the back of the bakery. Closed the door behind him. I sat at one of the tables and watched Emily work. After a few minutes she leaned closer. Dad, you two okay? Of course. You've both been weird lately. I hesitated. Then asked quietly. Emily, do you know exactly how much debt the bakery has right now? She blinked. What do you mean? Loans. Credit lines. Equipment financing. Her expression changed. Slight confusion. Slight worry. I thought you knew all that stuff, she said. I used to. She wiped flour from her hands. Kyle handles that now. There it was again. Kyle handles that now. The office door opened. Kyle stepped out holding a stack of invoices. He noticed Emily and me talking. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Emily said quickly. Kyle placed the papers on the counter. Then he looked directly at me. "You here to audit us or something?" The question sounded like a joke. But the tone wasn't. "I just came to say hello," I said. He nodded slowly. "Good." Then he added something that made my stomach tighten. "Because the bakery is doing great. We don't really need financial advice anymore." Emily looked uncomfortable. "Kyle." But he continued. "We appreciate everything you did at the beginning, Daniel." Again my name. "Not Dad." "Really. But we've got things under control." For a moment I considered responding. Pointing out the rising expenses. The unexplained loans. The equipment purchases. But I didn't. Instead I simply nodded. "Good to hear." And I left. That afternoon I sat in my home office staring at the financial records I still had from the early years of the bakery. The original loan agreements. The equipment financing documents. The supplier contracts. Everything. Then I noticed something strange. One of the supplier accounts had changed. The bakery used to buy flour from a local mill. Reliable. High quality. But the invoices showed a new distributor. The company name looked unfamiliar. I searched for it online. The website was simple. Almost too simple. Then I saw the address. It wasn't a warehouse. It wasn't a factory. It was a small office building on the other side of the city. That alone wasn't suspicious. But when I checked the business registration, my stomach dropped. The owner of the company was listed as Kyle Morgan, my son-in-law. For a long time I just stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. Because if Kyle owned the flour supplier, that meant every single bag of flour the bakery bought was being sold by him. Which meant the rising ingredient costs suddenly made perfect sense. Kyle wasn't just running the bakery. He was quietly paying himself through a second company. And Emily. Emily had no idea. But that discovery raised an even bigger question. How much money had he already taken from the business? For the next hour I didn't move from my chair. The screen of my laptop glowed in the dim light of my office. Kyle Morgan. Owner. Registered 3 months earlier. The company name looked innocent enough. Golden Grain Supply LLC. But the address was a small office suite on the north side of the city. Not a warehouse. Not a mill. Just an office. Which meant one thing. Kyle wasn't producing flour. He was reselling it. And judging by the bakery's rising costs, he was reselling it to his own business. At a higher price. I leaned back slowly in my chair. 40 years working with finances had taught me something important. Fraud rarely begins with large theft. It begins with small adjustments. Tiny numbers that no one questions. 8% here. 12% there. Then the numbers grow. And grow. Until someone finally notices. I opened the bakery's old supplier contracts. The original flour cost had been $21 per bag. The new invoices from Golden Grain Supply listed the price at $29 per bag. $8 more. The bakery went through almost 400 bags a month. I did the math. That meant Kyle's company was collecting an extra $3,200 every month. $3,200. The exact amount of the building lease. I stared at the numbers. Then another detail caught my eye. The invoices were signed. Not by Kyle. By Emily. Which meant Kyle had convinced her to approve the supplier change. But she probably didn't know the company belonged to him. I closed my laptop slowly. Because suddenly the situation looked much worse than I first thought. If Kyle was willing to secretly profit from the bakery, while I was paying most of the bills, then this wasn't just bad business. It was betrayal. Still, I didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, I decided to watch. 2 days later, I drove to the address listed for Golden Grain Supply. The building was small. 2 floors. Mostly insurance offices and consulting firms. I parked across the street and waited. After about 15 minutes, a familiar truck pulled into the parking lot. Kyle stepped out. He walked inside carrying a laptop bag. I checked my watch. 10:30 in the morning. Right in the middle of the bakery's busiest hours. So while Emily was baking and serving customers, Kyle was here. Running his second business. I stayed in the car another 20 minutes. When he finally came back outside, he was talking on the phone. Laughing. Relaxed. Confident. The kind of confidence people have when they believe no one knows their secret. I drove away before he could notice my car. But the truth was already clear. Kyle wasn't just running the bakery. He was quietly draining money from it. Money that was partly mine. Money that Emily believed was going into the business. That evening Emily called me. Her voice sounded worried. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Kyle says we might need to take another loan." I sat up straight. "What kind of loan?" "For operating costs." My chest tightened. "Emily, the bakery shouldn't need an operating loan right now." "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "But Kyle says ingredient prices have gone crazy." I looked at the numbers again in my mind. $8 per bag. 400 bags a month. Kyle's private profit. "Emily," I said carefully, "has Kyle shown you the full financial reports lately?" Silence. Then she admitted something that made my heart sink. "No." At that moment I understood something important. Emily wasn't part of Kyle's plan. She was just another person being misled. But before I could explain anything, my phone buzzed with a new message. A message from Kyle. 3 sentences. Cold. Final. "Stay out of our business. We don't need your money anymore. And stop coming to the bakery." I looked at the screen for a long time. Because Kyle thought he had just pushed me away. But in reality, he had just given me the perfect reason to do exactly what I had already been considering. Remove every dollar I had been quietly putting into their bakery. And let Kyle try to run his little empire. Without it. For several minutes after reading Kyle's message, I didn't reply. I simply sat there in my office. Phone in my hand. The words glowing on the screen. Stay out of our business. The strange thing was, I didn't feel angry. Not at first. Mostly I felt tired. Tired of pretending I didn't see what was happening. Tired of watching my daughter trust someone who clearly didn't deserve it. But what hurt the most was the realization that Kyle believed he had already won. That message wasn't written in anger. It was written with confidence. Confidence that the bakery no longer needed me. Confidence that he could run everything alone. I typed 2 words. No problem. Then I placed the phone on my desk. For a long moment I stared at the wall. 40 years of financial work had taught me something simple. When people believe they no longer need support, the best way to test that belief is to remove the support. Quietly. Without arguments. Without threats. Just numbers. I opened my laptop. Logged into my banking account. The first automatic transfer appeared on the screen. Morning Crust building lease. $3,200, monthly. For 6 years that payment had left my account on the first day of every month. Without it, the bakery would have exactly 30 days before the landlord started calling. I hovered my cursor over the payment. Then clicked cancel. The second payment was the equipment loan. Industrial ovens. Commercial mixers. Refrigeration units. Everything that made the bakery function. $1,150, monthly. I canceled that one too. Then the supplier credit line. $980 every month for ingredients. Cancelled. Next came the insurance policy. Another few $100. Cancelled. One by one. Every quiet support system behind their business disappeared. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair. And for the first time that evening, I smiled. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because Kyle had finally gotten exactly what he asked for. Independence. The phone rang an hour later. Emily. I answered. Her voice sounded nervous. Dad, did something happen with the bank? What do you mean? Kyle said some of the automatic payments disappeared. They did. Silence filled the line. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. Why? I spoke calmly. Because Kyle asked me to stay out of your business. Another silence. Longer this time. I didn't mean for that to happen, Emily said quietly. That message came from him, not me. I know. But the message was clear. Emily sighed softly. We're going to talk about it tonight. I hope you do. Before hanging up she said something that sounded more worried than angry. Dad, the bakery can't run without those payments. I understand. And I truly did. Because the truth was simple. Without those payments, Morning Crust had about 6 weeks before the real problem started. 6 weeks before the landlord called. 6 weeks before the equipment company demanded payment. 6 weeks before suppliers stopped delivering ingredients. 6 weeks before Kyle realized something important. Running a successful bakery is hard. Running one without the money that built it is almost impossible. And the moment those 6 weeks passed, the first week passed quietly. Too quietly. The bakery continued operating like nothing had changed. Morning Crust still opened at 6 every morning. Customers still lined up outside. Emily still posted photos of fresh pastries on social media. If someone looked from the outside, they would never guess anything was wrong. But I knew how businesses work. Financial problems don't explode immediately. They grow silently. Bills arrive. Payments get delayed. Credit lines shrink. Then suddenly everything begins collapsing at once. 2 weeks after I canceled the payments, Emily called again. Her voice sounded different this time. Tired. Dad, can we talk? Of course. There was a pause before she continued. Kyle says the landlord contacted him today. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. That was quick. He wants to know why the lease payment didn't go through. What did Kyle tell him? That the bank made a mistake. I almost laughed. Banks rarely make mistakes like that. And landlords rarely wait long when rent is missing. Emily, I said gently, did Kyle explain where the lease money was supposed to come from? Silence. Then she admitted quietly. He said the bakery could handle it now. And can it? Another silence. No. That one word told me everything I needed to know. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then Emily asked something carefully. Dad, can you turn the payments back on? The question didn't surprise me. But I didn't answer immediately. Instead I asked a different question. Does Kyle still want me to stay out of your business? She hesitated. I don't know. Then you should ask him. She sighed. We argued about it last night. What did he say? He said the bakery will survive without your help. I leaned back in my chair. Then let's give him the chance to prove it. Emily didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded softer. Dad, something else happened. What? The flour supplier stopped delivering this morning. That caught my attention. Why? Kyle said they want payment up front now. Of course they did. Because if Kyle owned the supplier company, he probably couldn't keep the illusion running once the bakery stopped paying. But Emily didn't know that yet. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know. Her voice sounded close to breaking. We only have enough flour for 2 more days. I felt a small knot tighten in my chest. Because Emily wasn't the problem. She never had been. But the situation Kyle created was finally starting to reach her. And that part of the story was only just beginning. 3 days later the first real crack appeared. I was sitting in my living room watching the evening news when my phone buzzed again. This time the message came from Kyle. Not Emily. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at the screen. Then typed my response. About what? The reply came immediately. About the bakery. For a moment I considered ignoring him. But curiosity won. So I wrote back. Tomorrow morning. My house. Kyle arrived exactly at 9. He looked different than the last time I saw him. More tense. Less confident. The same man who had told me to stay out of his business. Now stood on my porch holding a folder full of papers. And the moment he stepped inside my house, I realized something interesting. Kyle wasn't here to argue. He was here because the bakery was already starting to fall apart. Kyle didn't sit down immediately. He stood in the middle of my living room holding the folder in his hands. For a man who usually walked into every room like he owned it, he suddenly looked unsure of himself. Coffee? I asked. He shook his head. No. I sat calmly in the armchair across from him. So, I said. What do you want to talk about? Kyle finally sat down. He opened the folder and spread several papers across the table. Invoices. Loan statements. Supplier bills. The bakery is having temporary cash flow problems, he said. Temporary. I almost smiled. What kind of problems? The lease payment bounced. I heard. And the equipment company called yesterday. I'm not surprised. Kyle rubbed his forehead. They want the next payment immediately. That's how loans work. He looked up at me, clearly irritated. You know what I mean. I didn't answer. For a moment he just stared at the papers. Then he said something that almost sounded like an accusation. You could have warned us before canceling everything. That made me raise an eyebrow. You warned me first. He frowned. What? You told me to stay out of your business. Silence filled the room. Kyle looked away. Then he muttered something under his breath. Things were said in the heat of the moment. No, I said calmly. They were written in a message. He didn't respond. Instead he pushed one of the papers toward me. It was a financial statement. The bakery's cash account. The number at the bottom was smaller than I expected. Much smaller. How much debt does the bakery have right now? I asked. Kyle hesitated. Then said quietly. About 90,000. I leaned back in my chair. That number confirmed everything. Kyle had been draining money from the business much faster than I thought. And you believe turning the payments back on will fix that? He nodded quickly. Yes. How? The bakery is still popular. Popularity doesn't pay loans. His jaw tightened. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he tried a different approach. Look. Daniel. Again my name. We both want the same thing. Oh. The bakery to succeed. That's true. So let's fix this. I folded my hands together. What exactly are you asking for? Kyle exhaled slowly. Turn the payments back on. And maybe help us refinance some of the debt. I watched his face carefully. The confidence he used to have was gone. In its place was something else. Pressure. Fear. He knew the situation was slipping out of his control. But there was one thing he still didn't know. One detail that completely changed the situation. I leaned forward slightly. Kyle, can I ask you a question? Sure. Does Emily know you own Golden Grain Supply? The color drained from his face instantly. For a moment he looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. Where did you hear that? He asked quietly. I saw the business registration. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Kyle looked down at the table. Then he muttered. It's just a side business. A side business that sells flour to your own bakery. It's normal in business. Not when your father-in-law is paying most of the bills. His hands tightened around the edge of the table. You don't understand how things work now. I understand perfectly. Another long silence followed. Then I said the words that finally ended the conversation. The payments will not be turned back on. Kyle looked up sharply. You're serious? Yes. What about Emily? I'll help Emily. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means the bakery's future will depend on one simple condition. Kyle leaned forward. What condition? I held his gaze calmly. You will no longer be running it. For the first time since he walked into my house. Kyle looked truly afraid. Because he was finally beginning to realize something important. The quiet support system behind his business was gone. And without it, his control over the bakery was disappearing too. Kyle didn't speak for several seconds after I said those words. You will no longer be running it. The sentence hung in the air like a heavy weight. Finally he shook his head. That's not going to happen. His voice sounded sharper now. More defensive. You can't just take the business away from us. I'm not taking anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply refusing to continue financing it. Kyle stood up abruptly. You're doing this to punish me. No. I'm doing this because the bakery is collapsing. He laughed bitterly. It was doing fine until you canceled the payments. That's not true, I said quietly. The bakery was already bleeding money. He stopped pacing and looked at me. What do you mean? Instead of answering, I slid a printed sheet across the table. The numbers I had calculated the night before. Supplier invoices. Loan payments. Hidden profit margins. Kyle's side company. He stared at the page. Then at me. Then back at the page again. You went through our records. I went through the records I helped create. He didn't say anything. But the silence confirmed everything. You've been selling flour to the bakery through your own company, I continued. You raised the price by $8 per bag. That's normal markup, he muttered. Not when the bakery is already drowning in debt. His jaw tightened. You don't understand how business works. I almost smiled. Kyle, I spent 40 years advising businesses on exactly this. He looked away. And that was the moment I knew he understood the truth. He had been caught. Does Emily know? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Which was answer enough. The room stayed silent for a long time. Finally Kyle spoke again. What do you want? A simple question. But the tone had changed. The confidence was gone now. All that remained was pressure. I want the bakery to survive, I said. And the only way that happens. I tapped the financial report. Is if the person draining money from it is no longer in control. Kyle looked furious. You're trying to push me out. I'm trying to save the business. You're manipulating Emily against me. I'm protecting my daughter. Those words finally broke whatever composure he had left. Kyle grabbed the folder from the table. You think she'll choose you? I don't know. But she deserves to know the truth. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he said something that sounded more like a warning. If you tell her about the supplier company, you'll destroy this family. I met his gaze calmly. No. You already did that yourself. Kyle left my house 10 minutes later. The front door slammed behind him. The sound echoed through the hallway. For a while I simply sat there in silence. Because the next part of the story wasn't about money anymore. It was about Emily. She still believed the bakery was struggling because of rising costs. She still believed Kyle was trying to fix it. She still believed her husband was protecting the business. But the truth was very different. And the moment she discovered it, everything would change. 2 days later she came to my house. Her eyes looked red. Like she hadn't slept. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. And the first thing she asked was the question I had been expecting. Dad, what did Kyle do? I looked at her quietly for a moment. Then I turned my laptop toward her. The screen showed the registration documents. Golden Grain Supply LLC. Owner, Kyle Morgan. Emily stared at the screen. At first she didn't react. Then her face slowly changed. Confusion. Shock. Then something worse. Betrayal. Because in that moment, she finally understood where the bakery's missing money had been going. And the realization hit her harder than I expected. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He's been paying himself, with the bakery's money. I nodded slowly. And that was the moment the final collapse began. Emily didn't speak for almost a full minute. She just stared at the screen. At the company registration. At Kyle's name listed as the owner. Then she slowly closed the laptop. Her hands were shaking. All this time, she said quietly. He told me ingredient prices were going up. I nodded. That's what he wanted you to believe. She leaned back in the chair. Her eyes looked distant. Like she was replaying the last 2 years in her mind. Every invoice. Every conversation. Every excuse. Dad, she said finally. How long has this been happening? About 3 months. She closed her eyes. And the bakery debt? Mostly created during those same 3 months. Emily covered her face with her hands. For a moment the room was completely silent. Then she whispered something that sounded more painful than angry. I trusted him. I didn't say anything. Because sometimes people don't need advice. They just need the truth to settle. After a while Emily looked up again. What happens now? That depends on you, I said. The bakery can still survive. Her eyes lifted slightly. How? The business itself is still strong. The customers are still coming. But the finances need to be rebuilt. And Kyle, she asked. That part is your decision. She didn't answer immediately. Instead she stood up slowly and walked to the window. The afternoon sunlight filled the room. For several seconds she simply stood there. Then she turned back toward me. He lied to me, she said. Yes. He lied to the bakery. Yes. And he used your money to do it. I nodded. Emily's voice became very calm. The kind of calm that usually comes after someone has already made a decision. Then he's not running that bakery anymore. 2 weeks later the situation changed completely. Kyle moved out of the apartment above the bakery. Emily took full control of the business accounts. The supplier contract with Golden Grain Supply disappeared immediately. They returned to the original flour mill. Ingredient costs dropped overnight. I didn't celebrate. I simply watched. Because rebuilding a business is slower than breaking one. But slowly. The numbers began improving. The landlord received his payments again. The equipment loan was renegotiated. And the bakery continued doing what it had always done best. Selling bread. Selling pastries. Making people happy every morning. One Saturday about a month later I stopped by the bakery. The line outside the door was longer than ever. Inside the shop Emily stood behind the counter helping customers. When she saw me she smiled. The same smile she had during the first year. "Morning, Dad." "Morning." She handed me a warm croissant. On the house. I sat near the window with my coffee. Watching the customers. Listening to the sound of the ovens in the kitchen. Everything felt calm again. Stable. The way a good business should feel. After a few minutes Emily sat down across from me. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on the bakery." I smiled slightly. "I never did." Then she asked the question I had been expecting. "Did you know all this would happen?" I took a sip of coffee. "No. But I did know something important." "What?" "That numbers eventually tell the truth." Emily nodded slowly. Outside, the morning sun filled the street with light. Customers continued walking through the door. And the bakery kept running. Only now. It was finally being run honestly. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.